On February 17th, in 1600, the 52-year-old Italian Giordano Bruno had his tongue clamped by the Roman Inquisition, was stripped naked, bound to a wooden stake over a pyre in a public square in Rome, and roasted alive before a crowd of Christians, his ashes thrown in the Tiber River. One eyewitness, the German Gaspar Schoppe, wrote that, as the flames were dancing at Bruno's feet, a crucifix was raised to his face, as if to give the man one last chance to flatter the church with a repentance. But in a final act of defiance, Bruno turned away, giving new emphasis to his own words written 15 years earlier, quote, "Truly a dignified and heroic death is better than a mean, low triumph." This essay will glance at the debated reasons why Giordano Bruno was executed and venture into the writings and ideas of the man himself, so that we might shed light on the giant mind of this philosopher, whose unspoken words on the day of his death still rage as a fire of mystery for free thinkers over 4 centuries later. Today's video is sponsored by Gallowglass Books, an independent publisher based in Palm Beach, Florida. Gallowglass Books has published a beautiful edition of Thomas Taylor's translations of the Neoplatonists and is set to release their new hardcover edition of Francis Yates' Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition in April. This work is a must-read for anyone interested in Giordano Bruno and how the Hermetic writings influenced the Renaissance. Go get your copy of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition through the link below in the description and support this independent publisher. The famous bronze statue of Giordano Bruno stands in Campo dei Fiori, that same square in the center of Rome where Bruno was executed. It was sculpted by the Freemason Ettore Ferrari and erected in 1889, nearly 2 decades after the overthrow of papal rule in Rome and the city's incorporation into the secular Kingdom of Italy. The statue stood much to the wrath of the Vatican, who tried and failed in the 1920s to get Mussolini to take it down. The plaque at its base reads, quote, "To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw, here where the fire burned." This statue immortalizes the face-off between Giordano Bruno and the Catholic Church, which has still not offered a sincere statement of regret over Bruno's sentencing. Only scant allusions to a sad episode and the brutal manner of his execution. Indeed, if not for burning him alive, Bruno might not have become so seared in the reflections of free thinkers. May it still echo as Bruno declared upon hearing his sentence, quote, "You, O judges, feel perchance more terror in pronouncing this judgment than I do in hearing it." But for nearly 3 centuries, there was no definitive proof of his execution. This absence of publicly available documentation allowed 19th century Catholic apologists to continue to claim Bruno had never been executed. But in the 1860s, Domenico Berti discovered proof of the savage act and uncovered a long-standing cover-up by the Catholic Church to hide the facts of Bruno's sentence. But still nothing had been uncovered or revealed about the list of charges made against him, even when Pope Leo XIII opened the uncomfortably large Vatican archives to select researchers in an effort to mend some of the Church's fractured reputation. The documents on Bruno were rather conveniently moved into Pope Leo's private archive, where they could not damage the Church's efforts towards a renewed public tolerance. But in 1940, Cardinal Angelo Mercati, then prefect of the Vatican archives, discovered a summary document of Bruno's trial, which was published in 1942. This summary is, however, unusually inadequate for an unusually long trial that began in 1593 and ended with his execution in 1600. And it contains nothing of Bruno's apparent 16 interrogations. Mercati himself wrote that the Church was perfectly justified in Bruno's condemnation. Were the treasured trial records and transcripts that tell the full story somehow lost between 1810 and 1817, when Napoleon ordered a slew of Vatican documents to be transferred to Paris? Documents later returned and possibly damaged in transit. Perhaps we will never know. Even modern Catholic stances on Bruno innovate new hyphenated insults against him, both squirming out of historical responsibility for his execution, while simultaneously admitting he was executed for his so-called theological errors. See the rather silly 2020 article from the Catholic Angelo Stagnaro in the National Catholic Register, where Bruno's case is described as, quote, extremely lenient. The notion that Giordano Bruno was wrongly executed remains indigestible for many Catholic scholars bound to their biases and their proclivity to deflect away from the Inquisition's misdeeds and instead focus on the heresies of its victims. On the 400th anniversary of Bruno's death, in the year 2000, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the then Vatican Secretary of State, described Bruno's death as a, quote, sad episode and expressed regrets for the violence used against him, while at the same time Sodano qualifies these regrets with the claim that Bruno's inquisitors, quote, had the desire to serve freedom and promote the common good and did everything possible to save his life. Yes, everything possible to save his life except untying him from the stake and not roasting him alive in a public square. Regrets appear more for the manner of Giordano's execution and the brutality of the times rather than the charges made against him. The Church could by no means express regrets about condemning Bruno on theological grounds. These dogmatic grounds are not made to shake like Mount Vesuvius, or to be updated as new information comes. And it is strictly theological differences which the Church focuses on when it comes to Bruno, swerving away from the idea that Bruno was killed because he believed the stars in the heavens were other suns with other worlds of their own in an infinite universe. Galileo, on the other hand, whose trial occurred in the same square and was presided over by the same inquisitor 10 years later, was later admitted to be correct on his heliocentric model by Catholic authorities. Bruno received no such treatment. The Catholics who also claim Bruno was never tortured despite offering no proof must suffer no concept of what it's like languishing in a prison cell, let alone being imprisoned in an underground dungeon for 6 to 7 years without writing materials. We can, after all, put events inside of their historical context and still be correct in observing that they are unjust. But what is more interesting than Bruno's mistreatment are the ideas immortalized by his martyrdom and his skill. Bruno has been tagged with every title from Hermeticist, Kabbalist, humanist, freethinker, spy, magician, scientist, mathematician, philosopher, and more. A true Renaissance man who everywhere butted against the large heads of religious authority. Unsurprisingly, Bruno has served as a proud symbol of defiance for the enemies of the Church, and for scientific enthusiasts, championing the history of free thinkers in the face of a long timeline of religious persecution. But with the proliferation of titles attributed to Bruno comes more questions than answers, and many schools of thought merely use him for their own advantage while ignoring his more daring theosophical developments. And we should not content ourselves with only a flowery view of a man who very well may have been disagreeable to his core and tethered by ambition to conflict, too far or out of his time to be tolerated. Giordano Bruno was born in Italy, in the city of Nola, near Naples, in 1548. At the age of 17, he entered a Dominican convent. In 1572, he became a priest and earned a license as a theologian in 1575. The same year, he was investigated for his heretical views. In 1576, he fled the convent and the resulting conflicts inherent in his rebellious tendencies, becoming an excommunicate and a heretical fugitive of his order. This event, possibly a result of Bruno's interest in Arianism and certain banned writings, foreshadows other conflicts that roamed across Europe with him. After wandering through northern Italy, he joined the Calvinists in Geneva, Switzerland, and in 1579 was excommunicated and briefly imprisoned after publishing an attack on Antoine de la Faye, a prominent academic. This attack was a list of 20 errors Bruno had apparently found in de la Faye's lectures. In prison, he was made to publicly retract his statements, after which he was released. He afterward traveled to France, where in 1582 he wrote 3 of his notable books, On the Shadows of Ideas, The Song of Circe, and The Art of Memory. In Paris, he gave public lectures, earning the attention of King Henry III of France, who was impressed by Bruno's art of memory. His book On the Shadows of Ideas, addressed to the king, features a dialogue between Hermes and 2 other characters. This dialogue sets forth a kind of template, if you will, which Bruno will use in future writings, placing himself in these dialogues with one or another stand-in character. But with Hermes as the major character in this work, we are one step closer to identifying Bruno's Hermeticism, which of course was influenced by Marsilio Ficino and Lazzarelli's translations of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463 and 1492 respectively. To be clear, at this point in the 16th century, Hermetic enthusiasts of Europe were still under the belief that the Hermes who authored the corpus either predated or was a contemporary of Moses. This allowed many writers to assume that Platonists, to give one example, were influenced by Hermes Trismegistus, and not the other way around. It was not until the insights of Isaac Casaubon in 1614 that this chronology was reshuffled, and the many Hermeses who authored the texts in the corpus were shown to be pseudonymous sages of later antiquity, comfortably ensconced in the centuries immediately preceding and following the birth of Christ. However, there would still be later writers, such as the Freemason and member of the Royal Society, Chevalier Ramsay, in the 18th century, who, even with the insights of Casaubon, rejected the idea that the Corpus Hermeticum was an isolated instance of late Egyptian philosophy, but was in fact predated by other Hermetic writings that did not survive. Ramsay, for one, uses the Ciceronian observation of there being up to 5 different Hermes as a basis for this claim. Surely not just the late Trismegistus was the only Hermes to preside over a large body of Egyptian teachings. In any case, Giordano Bruno's life trajectory was entirely altered after King Henry III's fond reception of his works. Bruno may very well have had in his possession some letter affording him diplomatic immunity, and perhaps a sizable purse to draw upon as he takes his next travels to London. And before Bruno arrives into London, we find a warning about him given to Francis Walsingham by Henry Cobham, the English ambassador in Paris, where Henry said, quote, "Dr. Giordano Bruno Nolano, a professor in philosophy, intends to pass into England, whose religion I cannot recommend." Upon entering England, Bruno sets out to furnish himself with some of the opportunities he drummed up in France with his art of memory, and he writes to the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, including some rather lively language in his address, where he refers to himself as, quote, "the waker of sleeping souls, tamer of presumptuous and recalcitrant ignorance, proclaimer of a general philanthropy, who chooses the more peaceable-minded, loyal, and useful fellows to consort with, and, quote, who is hated by the propagators of foolishness and hypocrites, but sought out by the honest and the studious." We are here made to wonder if this kind of behavior is what led the French mathematician, philosopher, and theologian Marin Mersenne to say, quote, "It is reasonable to denounce Bruno as one of the most evil men that the earth has ever borne." In Bruno's work, The Ash Wednesday Supper, published in 1584, he recalls disputing certain doctors of theology in front of the Polish prince Alasco and other English nobles. And speaking of himself in the third person, quote, "Learn how aptly he replied to the arguments, how the wretched doctor who was put forward as the leader of the academy on that grave occasion came to a halt 15 times over 15 syllogisms, like a chicken amongst stubble." This leader of the academy is called a rudely pig, and we wonder how much of this is Bruno's bitterness as a result of being driven out or disallowed to continue certain public lectures he was giving on the soul. Intriguingly, we are allowed to peer at this episode through the eyes of George Abbot, a later Archbishop of Canterbury, who was present at Bruno's visit to Oxford, and recalls that Bruno had entitled and indulged himself to a name longer than his body. Abbot recalls that when Bruno was before the Polish Duke, quote, his heart was on fire to make himself by some worthy exploit to become famous in that celebrated place. He undertook, among very many other matters, to set foot the opinion of Copernicus, that the earth did go round, and the heavens did stand still, whereas in truth it was his own head which rather did run round, and his brains which did not stand still. Needless to say, this bit hasn't aged well for Abbot. As Francis Yates said of this episode, quote, what a marvelous scene. And we begin to wonder more why so much animosity towards Bruno. Well, in Bruno's own words, in the introductory epistle of his On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, printed in 1584, he explains it, quote, since I would survey the field of nature, care for the nourishment of the soul, foster the cultivation of talent, become expert as Daedalus concerning the ways of the intellect, lo, one doth threaten upon beholding me, another doth assail me at sight, another doth bite upon reaching me, yet another who hath caught me would devour me. Not one, nor few, they are many, indeed almost all. If you would know why, it is because I hate the mob. I loathe the vulgar herd, and in the multitude I find no joy. It is unity that doth enchant me. By her power I'm free through thrall, happy in sorrow, rich in poverty, and quick even in death. As we know that quickness in death would be put to the test in the 7 years of Bruno's trial, where at the end Bruno was still so far gone from conforming to the church and state's social cohesion that even when he did apparently recant at times, he spoke as it were out of two sides of his mouth, and doubled down on his beliefs. This sorry, not sorry theme is true also in his non-apology apology for his attack on Oxford, where his intellectual adversaries are merely grammarian pedants, who put far too much trust in their, quote, Lord and Master Aristotle. But if we step back to Abbot's third-party proof of Bruno's advocacy for some peculiar heliocentric model, we touch on the striking cosmological insight which has grafted Bruno into the soul of history. Bruno did indeed believe and advertise that the stars in the heavens were other suns with other worlds of their own. In his famous On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, Bruno does not regard the universe as infinite and then stop, as it were, at the gates of this realization, but uses his battering ram to punch right through and delve into the implications, reappointing the eternal powers of God to their boundlessness, while accounting for the limits of the imbecilic minds of mortals who, even should we understand the Almighty, must simultaneously admit to the gaping ignorance that accompanies this understanding. But, quote, for the same reason that our space doth exist, so also should exist every other possible world. And, quote, for the heaven is declared to be a single general space, embracing the infinity of worlds, though we do not deny that there are other infinite heavens, using that word in another sense. For just as this earth hath her own heaven, which is her own region, through which she moveth and hath her course, so the same may be said of each of the innumerable other worlds. This same point is reinforced in a variety of ways. We can find in other works of his, such as The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, further examples alluding to Bruno's conception of God and the ensuing implications of this model for the universe. In this work, Bruno emphasizes the prestige and superiority of the ancient religion of the Egyptians, whose worship was to Bruno really that worship of God in all things. And in good Hermetic fashion, it is written as a dialogue between the goddess Isis and a certain Momus. In one place, Bruno, as Isis, writes, "You see then how one simple divinity which is in all things, one fecund nature, mother and preserver of the universe, shines forth in diverse subjects, and takes diverse names, according as it communicates itself diversely. You see how one must ascend to this one by the participation in diverse gifts. In his dialogues in the Heroic Enthusiasts, presented in a poetic philosophical style with interspersed sonnets, Bruno rejects the, quote, stupid pedants who judge poetry by the rules they have concocted in hindsight, thinking that the same rules apply to every genius who drinks from the fountain of a different muse. Quote, I say there are as many sorts of poets as there are human sentiments and ideas. This and many statements besides give a picture of Bruno's independence and unitive thinking. Here he quotes Pythagoreans, there the Platonists, here a Kabbalist, and there the Hermetica. Bruno makes clear his belief of the inevitable oneness of God and the infinite secondaries that are implied therein. Quote, of the first there can only be one, as there can be only one ultimate and one primal good. Of the second, the modes are infinite. He delivers his insightful understanding of the descent of the soul into the earthly experience, likening it to a prison and determining, like all great mystics, that an ascent towards the beautiful and the unspeakable divine light is a chief aim of the heroic soul. This is nothing new for Bruno, who criticized his opponents that claimed he was creating a new and false sect by instead presenting his doctrines as a mean to, quote, establish the ancient and true. That Bruno believed he was in keeping with the ancient philosophical tradition is evident. That Prisca Theologia passed like a torch through many hands, Egyptian, Orphic, Pythagorean, Hermetic, Platonic, Kabbalistic, and more. When it comes to emotions, Bruno champions the idea of a moderation between extremes, so as not to invite the backswing of opposites, and instead to, with a quickness and a gentle grace, assimilate the good and the beautiful, by which means man may perfect himself. In good keeping with Platonic, Iamblichian, and Hermetic sentiments, he says, quote, he becomes a god by intellectual contact with the divine object, and he has no thought for other than divine things, and shows himself insensible and impassive towards those things which are commonly felt, and about which others are mostly tormented. He fears nothing, and for love of the divine, he despises other pleasures, and gives no thought to this life. It is a glow kindled by the intellectual sun in the soul, and a divine impetus which lends it wings, with which, drawing nearer and nearer to the intellectual sun, and ridding itself of the rust of human cares, it becomes a gold tried and pure, has the perception of divine and internal harmony, and its thoughts and acts accord with the symmetry of the law innate in all things. The mystic enthusiast, for Bruno, has no better means for kindling the semblance of an accurate vision of divinity than through the mind and the intellect, whereas to extract a final concept of divinity through the senses or through any corporeal symbol always fails to deliver what one's own mind can bring, once it has, with the captain of a disciplined will, overcome the inferior desires. Quote, in such conceptions and similitudes, the human intellect of this lower world nourishes itself, till such time as it will be lawful to behold with purer eye the beauty of the divinity. In the dialogue it is asked whether the body is the habitation of the soul, and it is answered, no, because the soul is not in the body locally. The body, then, is in the soul in the mind either is God or is in God, as Plotinus said. As we begin to reach deeper into this obscure text, we come to understand the position love holds in Bruno's universe, as a fundamental divinity which binds everything, and underlies even the confusing results of our actions, which may at first seem to be void of love. Bruno says, quote, there is in us a certain sacred mind and intelligence, which supplies an affection of its own, which has its own avenger, which, through remorse for certain shortcomings, flagellates the transgressing spirit as with a hammer. It notes our actions and our affections, and as it is treated by us, so are we treated by it. To observe this kind of dialogue between the person and the love which supersedes it, and ultimately works on the person's behalf, is to determine what actions will lead to peace and progress, and which may lead to unnecessary suffering. Quote, "Most certainly there is a God in every man, but what God it is in each one is not so easy to know. And even though we should examine and distinguish, yet do I believe that none other than love could declare it, he being the one who pulls the oars and fills the sails, and modifies the compound, so that it comes to be well or ill affected. Thus the soul, striving to recover its natural beauty, seeks to purify itself, to heal itself, and to reform itself, and to this end it uses fire, because, being like gold, mixed with earth and crude, with a certain rigor it tries to liberate itself from defilement, and this result is obtained when the intellect, the real smith of Jove, puts itself to the work and causes an active exercise of the intellectual powers. This fiery intellect assumes the role of the god Vulcan, forging works and disciplines which can return the soul to its native harmony, and so naturally feel correct when that harmony is resonant in every thought and deed expressed in the world. Conversely, the Vulcan smith may forge works that further torment the soul. As Francis Yates makes clear, the gods are to Bruno aspects of the individual's internal cosmos, gods which preside over a certain dominant archetypal personality in the person. But if the human is absorbed too deeply in the crises and urgencies of the world, the soul, quote, becomes less diligent and active in the government of the body. Thus the body becomes lean, ill-nourished, attenuated, poor in blood, and rich in melancholy humors, and these may lead to insanity, folly, and brutal fury, or at least to a certain disregard of self, and a contempt of its own being. Love becomes subjugated and flies suddenly down to the earth, when it is attached to low things, but flies high when it is fixed upon more worthy enterprises. With this we can spy into the developing aim of the soul, determined to liberate itself from the classic obstacles of matter. With every instance of a soul proceeding out of a sense of lack, or being led about by fruitless desires which torment them in a chaos of emotion, the resulting negativity is a signal for the need to change, to reorient oneself to higher things, where the love is naturally soaring amidst friends more conducive to its nature, which is unbound, free, light, and unchained. And with this insider knowledge of the true powers of the soul, Bruno is inclined to see in magic the power of the individual's own beliefs at work. Quote, "Magicians can do more by means of faith than physicians by the truth, and in the worst diseases the patients benefit more by believing this or that which the former say, than in understanding that which the latter do." A curious thread between the placebo and the magician's art is woven here, which deserves more attention than we can give it. Indeed, to shine a light in every cavern Bruno illuminated with his works would require years of labor and context. Which is to say, it was with good reason Francis Yates spent 190 pages on the historical context of Bruno's world prior to getting to the life and philosophy of the man himself. But now that we're rounding out towards the end, let us develop more on Bruno's disagreeable stance with the brutish multitude and religious ineptitude he witnessed in his time, a time he contrasted to that ancient and more noble esoteric philosophy. For as Bruno writes to one of his philosophical opponents, before, quote, "the philosophy which suits you so well arose, there existed that of the Chaldeans, of the Egyptians, of the Magi, of the Orphics, of the Pythagoreans, and other early thinkers, which is more to our liking." For this ancient philosophy had spent ages entombed in dark caverns and was past due for resurrection, which would nonetheless appear as a sunrise event, though it had already shone its light across the earth. Bruno in one place reasserts his place in this resurrection with the qualification that, quote, Man's mind was suffocating in the close air of a narrow prison house whence only dimly, and as it were through chinks, could behold the far distant stars. His wings were clipped, so that he might not soar upwards through the cloudy veil to see what really lies beyond it, and liberate himself from the foolish imaginations of those who, issuing from the miry caverns of earth, as though they were Mercuries and Apollos descending from heaven, have with many kinds of deceit imposed brutish follies and vices upon the world in the guise of virtues. Behold now, standing before you, the man who has pierced the air and penetrated the sky, wended his way among broken stars, and overpassed the margins of the world, who has broken down those imaginary divisions between spheres, the first, the eighth, the ninth, the 10th, or what you will, which are described in the false mathematics of blind philosophy. He has given eyes to blind moles, and illuminated those who could not see their own image in the innumerable mirrors of reality which surround them on every side. Indeed, Bruno was correct in judging his muses as his thoughts, which present, quote, at every hour new beauties counted out. With these fiery words, we chill at the ascent of the free thinker, shrugging off the shackles of religious persecution and the rule-obsessed self-flagellation of the subservient mob, who would know no better but to wallow a bit more in the mires of ignorance, if not for the rebellious ecstasy mounting to a foothold and marching a figure like Bruno to the fiery death he seemed in so many places to predict for himself. If it is not yet clear by now why Bruno's writings were put in the index of forbidden books by the Roman Catholic Church and subjected to flames like the man himself, it could become no more transparent than when we find him posing the question of whether or not mankind is in the time of the revival of ancient philosophy, or whether that philosophy is in its death throes, as the suffocating veils of Christian dogma swallow up the virtues of the past, while offering nothing but stagnation to the future. Now, skipping over Bruno's second visit to Paris, and his adventures in Germany and elsewhere, we come to that fatal period of his return to Italy. For a certain bookseller in Venice, Giovanni Battista Giotto, had invited Bruno to Venice in order to learn from him the secrets of memory. In August of 1591, Bruno came to Venice, convinced he could write a book to present to the Pope and achieve some manner of a professorial position. Is it the case that Bruno's mission and ambition allowed him to think that he would be immune to the dangers of the Inquisitions? Did he truly believe he could find favor among Catholic authorities after having become so incompatible? Well, there were some political changes which one could see to be favorable for a man like Bruno, hoping for some level of Catholic reform, which might be more lenient on him. But when Bruno nears to travel to Frankfurt to get his new book on the 7 liberal arts printed for the Pope, hoping to land in his good graces, the Venetian nobleman Giovanni Mocenigo, who Bruno was staying with at Mocenigo's Venetian palace, denounced Bruno to the Venetian Inquisition. Mocenigo locked Bruno in his room until the inquisitors took and transported him to a state of imprisonment that would ultimately last 8 years and end with his death. The inquisitors questioned Bruno about his support for King Henry of Navarre, King Henry IV of France, and about a great deal of other matters we do not know the details of, on account of the official documents of Bruno's charges being lost. Now, despite Bruno at one point voicing his intention to recant the heresies he had been accused of, he only later insists that he'd never written anything for which he needed to recant. Rather, he was the victim of misinterpretations. The 8 specific heretical charges against Bruno, written up by the Jesuit Bellarmine, are lost, but if they were consistent with other episodes in the Roman Inquisition, these charges would have been more theological than scientific. We can, as many have, attempt to deduce that Bruno was charged for rejecting Jesus as the literal God incarnate, denying the Holy Trinity in favor of a pantheistic view, promulgating the doctrine of reincarnation or transmigration, denying the transubstantiation, or the notion that the bread and wine of the Eucharist are literally the flesh and blood of Christ, promoting the return to pagan magic, challenging the virginity of Mary, and of course the most hotly debated potential reason of Bruno's sentencing being his belief in an infinite universe filled with other stars and planets. However, this last instance seems to have been exaggerated in comparison with Bruno's other heresies. While the 8 charges are still a subject of speculation, Bruno's writings do not make it a challenge to suppose that these were included as some of the major reasons his fate was sealed in flames. But Bruno's victory in one respect is clear. We now know that the stars of the night sky are, in fact, other suns, with other planets of their own. And should we advance to the point of discovering that many of these planets also have life, we should imagine Giordano Bruno being championed evermore as the future of humanity's knowledge is revealed. After all, we live closer to Bruno's time than Plotinus did to Plato, than Philo Judaeus did to Moses, than Marcus Aurelius to Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school. In the end, Bruno lived and died by his philosophy, and in so doing, welded a link for himself on that golden chain of philosophers, bridging Homer to Plato, Hermes to Zoroaster, Pythagoras to Orpheus, Moses to Hermes Trismegistus. In closing with Bruno's words, quote, "I do not in weariness shun the arduous path, nor idly refrain my arm from the present task, nor retreat in despair from the enemy that confronts me, nor do I turn my dazzled eyes from the divine end." Thank you for watching this fascinating look into the life and works of Giordano Bruno, whose great ideas shall live on from that smoky air risen above Rome in 1600. Please like and subscribe and consider supporting the channel through the links below in the description.